Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tatou katoa. It's customary to start by saying who I am and where I'm from, but these will emerge through my talk. However, I was born in Fulham in London, where I lived until I left school. That's me with the plait. I came to Aotearoa in 2015 to work in sport and leisure studies here at Waikato. I made the journey with my family, and we made Whangaroa, Raglan, our new home. My talk tonight is about a different kind of journey, the development of my sociological imagination. Through this, I hope to show what the sociology of sport is and how one new and peripheral area, lifestyle sports, emerged, took hold and became something central to understanding both sport culture and contemporary society more widely. The sociological imagination is a concept that was coined by C. Wright Mills back in the mid-20th century, but still has resonance today. At that time, society was understood as social systems, but Wright Mills argued for the need to understand individual experiences, how our worldviews are products of both the historical context in which they exist and our everyday environments. As he wrote, neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. This approach, he argued, allows us to understand that what seems like an individual's private troubles are really social issues, and to expose the powerful groups that control our institutions, revealing social injustices and therefore enabling us to create social change. While Wright Mills's ideas were considered revolutionary and challenging to many at the time, they remained central to sociological practice. He also saw social science as the practice of a craft, and his notes on intellectual craftsmanship outline the importance of explaining how we go about our craft, starting from a personal statement about our own biography. So essentially, the sociological imagination is the critical ability to develop understanding of how our lives, our biography, unfolds within a broader historical and social context. It requires us to develop the capacity to shift from one perspective to the next, to separate ourselves from the familiarity of our own personal circumstances, beliefs, and traditions, and to identify and question various aspects of ourselves and of society. So my talk tonight will show how my developing sociological imagination led me to identify the social significance of informal and lifestyle sport, and why my interest has been sustained for 20 years. But first, as Wright Mills advised, I need to tell you a bit about me. As qualitative researchers now widely recognise, beneath every project is a hidden and personal history, which the researcher must reveal. So my starting point is my childhood experiences. My mum was born in Prague when it was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She came to England as a child, a refugee, at the start of World War II. By the time she was an adult, she spoke 3 languages fluently, and her close family were dispersed around the world. My dad was born in a working-class family in London's notorious East End. Despite leaving school at 14, over time he managed to get an education. He became an electronics engineer, working with a research group in the physics department of Imperial College London, and then started an environmental science instrumentation company. My dad was therefore really keen for me to have the privilege of a good education and to study STEM subjects. So I did physics and chemistry, which, as it turned out, I had little interest in or aptitude. My parents shared a love of the outdoors. My mum having spent a lot of her childhood in the Austrian Alps, and my dad developing a passion for climbing in the hills of Snowdonia. So despite growing up in the city, my childhood involved many adventures, including skiing in the Alps and sailing on the estuaries of England. I never became a climber, much to my dad's disappointment, as I was terrified of heights. But skiing became my passion, which I pursued as a competitive sport across the European Alps. I was then drawn back to the sea, learning to windsurf in my 20s and becoming a windsurfing instructor, where I met my partner Stuart, there on the middle slide. Through windsurfing, we got to travel extensively, and the ocean became my new home. In my early 20s, after these years immersed in the sporting world and working in the sport and fitness industry, I decided to go to university to study the relatively new degree of sports science. I chose to study in Brighton, well, clearly because it was on the sea. In those days, my degree title raised a few eyebrows, including from my mum, who, although she'd never been to university, was clearly concerned that studying sport was not a serious enterprise. But as I quickly learned, this was not going to be an easy option. I had to take first-year classes in anatomy, physiology, psychology, motor learning, biomechanics, and the history and philosophy of sport. Our research methods classes span from experimental methods and statistics to qualitative methodologies. Like many multidisciplinary degrees emerging at that time, we had challenging debates about methodology, epistemology, and the philosophy of science. It wasn't long before the sociocultural areas captivated me, particularly a course in gender issues in sport. I learned how historically sport had been closely identified with men and masculinity. Recognizing sport's significance as a site of gender regulation, the feminist movement was challenging this situation. The 1980s was a time of rapid change with increasing opportunities for women and girls across sport and physical education. This was a key time in my own feminist awakening, and also helped me to make sense of my own experiences of sport and PE at school. Despite being a sporty child who enjoyed team games, school sport was considered very uncool by my teenage friends, and the uniforms were quite horrific. And so, like my friends, I avoided any commitment to school sport. After completing my honours thesis, I headed to Goldsmiths College, London, to start my postgraduate training in the sociology department. Many of my lecturers were academic superstars, and their classes were just quite terrifying. I found it hard to understand the questions my fellow students were asking, let alone understand their debates. But I did come away with a better understanding of what sociology was and a clear direction for my PhD. I set off to Brighton with a doctoral scholarship from the Economic and Social Research Council, ESRC, to study in the Sport and Leisure Cultures Group under the experienced mentorship of Alan Tomlinson. In the words of Professor Jim McKay some years later, this group at the University of Brighton has become arguably the leading place in the world for the study of sport and leisure cultures. Whereas sports sociology at that time was focused on professional sport cultures, and in the US, particularly on college sport, the interests of this group were in the intersections of sport, leisure, the media, and everyday life. I wanted to understand the ways in which sport culture was being impacted by the wider societal shifts being documented in what Frederick Jameson called late capitalism, such as the fragmentation of identity and emergence of new forms of consumption. In the words of New Times commentator Martin Jacks a few years later, sport has become a symbol for our changing society, defining the nature of our new times. Sport, he argued, was interacting with and being driven by some of the most fundamental cultural shifts of our times, the new aspirations of women, body and fitness, fashion, leisure and prosperity. Sport is surfing all these trends and in the process being transformed by them. So my research focused on one new alternative sport, windsurfing, exploring the meaning of the activity and its associated social world for recreational participants. Windsurfing seemed to be different from many of the institutionalized and particularly competitive team-based sports I'd experienced through school and beyond. However, my emerging sociological imagination had shown me that to understand the meaning of sport required an awareness of the wider context in which lifestyle choices are made, particularly the impact of factors such as social class, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. My research, therefore, explored how identities, particularly gendered ones, were constructed, maintained, and policed. When starting my PhD, back in the 90s, I was one of only a handful of scholars worldwide interested in what was being called alternative or extreme sports. However, research was starting to emerge, especially in the USA, initially with Becky Beale's research on skateboarding and Bob Reinhardt on the X Games. Lifestyle sport is a concept I developed some years later to help conceptualize the experiences of participants in these mostly individualized alternative sports that had either emerged since the 1960s or, like surfing, were older but had taken a new meaning or focus. These activities presented a potential challenge to traditional ways of seeing, doing, and understanding sport. While there were differences between them, they shared a common countercultural heritage. Participants saw their cultures as different to the rule-bound, regulated, institutionalized sport. They often rejected the label sport itself, seeing their activities as part of a lifestyle project through which the individual's social self and identity was constructed, also informing consumption in other areas such as fashion and music, as well as their politics and ideological worldview. Lifestyle sports have experienced unprecedented growth, both in participation and in their visibility. Evolving in a time of expanding media and global communications, corporate influence across the leisure industries, and a growing affluent youth demographic, lifestyle sport have spread around the world far faster than most established sports. They became the focus of numerous television shows and films, and a lucrative industry around their commodities and experiences, from boards and clothing to tourism. The allure and excitement has been appropriated to sell every kind of product and service imaginable. The media's appetite for these sports was exemplified by the success of ESPN's X Games, which by 2003, less than 10 years after its inauguration, had a global audience of 50 million. Conversely, during this time, the youth audience for the Olympics was steadily declining, and I'll come back to this later in my talk. And television contracts for the North American Big Three, American football, baseball, and basketball, had lost the American network billions of dollars. These sports clearly had a significance beyond their relatively low numbers of dedicated participants. By the 21st century, research on action and lifestyle sport had proliferated, including across different sports and places, their gender politics, spatial politics, and processes of commercialization and professionalization. It was also clear that activities that were once on the margins and the domain of young white men were changing, with increasing participation across gender and age. They were also beginning to attract attention in policy circles. In 2005, with a group of colleagues at Brighton, we were commissioned to write a report for Sport England to explore how lifestyle sport could be used in national sport policies. While our research became widely referred to, It was another 10 years or more before Sport England acted on any of the findings. My own research turned to explore the more marginal or subordinated experiences and different sports. Was lifestyle sport solely the lifestyle choice of a privileged Western play world? And did they provide cultural spaces where the dominant ideologies of sport were challenged? I also wanted to tease out the ways in which discourses about these sports, such as risk, freedom, self-reliance, youth, empowerment, and environmental sensibilities, were circulated by medias and corporations. Between 2007 and 2013, I was involved in a range of projects related to these questions, and that became the focus of this book, published at the end of 2013 and translated by a Japanese scholar in 2019. So I'm just going to highlight 3 of these projects. First, however, as Wright Mills advises, I need to return to my own biography. As he stated, you must learn to use your life experiences in your intellectual work, continually to examine and interpret it. From my initial interest in windsurfing, lifestyle sport is something that is also a central part of my own life. I've been a participant in many activities on the sea and in the mountains, and most recently, I've been learning to wing foil. My involvement has ranged from beginner to international competitor, and my embodied experiences invoked excitement, terror, pleasure, and pain, at times all in the same day. I've also had involvement with local and national sporting organisations, run events, worked in the action sport industry, and as a writer for magazines. My 2 children's involvements across many lifestyle and traditional sports has also provided a different lens. So these multiple perspectives and ever-changing experiences through my life course have given me a longitudinal perspective, allowing me to reflect on continuity and change and the complexities of intersectional identities and the differences between and within these sports. In 2007, I was in Durban, South Africa, visiting Surfers Not Street Kids, a Surfing for Development initiative, which led to a project focused on a Durban skate park. This research was central in helping to unpack assumptions about lifestyle sports as exclusively privileged white and male spaces, and whether, in other cultural contexts, it was possible to re-envisage them. A group of mostly Zulu streets living on Durban's seafront had learned to skateboard at this local park because the man who ran it took them under his wing, loaning them boards and shoes. It became a safe space for them, and one that led some of the kids away from glue sniffing and back to school. Skateboarding appealed because it was free. There were no rules, time constraints, or adults, such as coaches. I was also struck that in contrast to most spaces I visited in Durban, which were highly delineated by ethnic groups, the so-called whites, coloured and blacks, the skate park was much more heterogeneous. And I was fascinated to discover that one of the appealing qualities about skateboarding in Durban was its newness. Skaters said that unlike sports like rugby and football, it was not associated with particular ethnic groups. This project fostered my interest in exploring lifestyle sports' ability to engage non-privileged youth, and also some of the barriers. Since the 1950s, the quintessential image of the surfing body has been of a young male, tanned with sun-blonde, bleach blonde hair. Fueled by the Hollywood beach movies and the Beach Boys music, in the USA, this image became so iconic, he became the face of California. Yet surfing did not originate in California. Although origin histories are complex, Polynesia is widely recognized as surfing's home. After Hawaii's colonization, white North Americans and Australians appropriated and redefined the activity in the middle part of the 20th century. Yet the colonization and racialization of surfing had received surprisingly little academic attention. This absence fueled my research, examining the formative and contemporary experiences of a small group of African American surfers in Los Angeles around 2009. My research showed the range of difficulties or constraints that many of these black surfers had faced, including experiences of racism and exclusion. These range from stereotypes, such as blacks don't swim, to historically rooted perceptions of outdoor spaces as white, and that visiting nature was not part of their culture. They recounted how their communities were still fearful of water and beaches. They said, stemming from past histories of the slave sea voyages from Africa, and how during the Jim Crow era, nature was a place of fear associated with lynching. This research provides a vivid illustration of the continued racialization of public space. As research on outdoor recreation amongst minority ethnic groups in the USA has found, invisible lines of segregation continue to exist. State resources from beaches to mountains remain the domain of white privileged communities, even when they are free and accessible. Surfing had also become an arena through which to confront and attempt to change these surfers' individual and collective exclusion. It was repeatedly described as political. Now, what this meant and the types of politics they engaged in varied. For some, it was just the freedom to just be in white space. However, others advocated more transformative actions, which they believed would eventually lead to social change. As my former colleague, sport and race scholar Ben Carrington outlines, sport has been seen as apolitical, a space for transcendence, removed from the everyday concerns of power, inequality, and ideology. Carrington's work shows how sport has had an important influence both on black politics and on how African diasporic people have viewed themselves and how these communities have come to be viewed. Likewise, the beach has often been regarded as a liminal, free, fun space, rather than recognized to be an important site where racial formations are created and policed. So for many surfers in my research, both the beach and surfing were sites of inequality and regulation. The Black Surfing Association was formed in the 1970s to create solidarity. Their activities have expanded, including publishing histories of black surfers, intervening in the mass and niche media to challenge stereotypes, and taking over beach space. As one of the interviewees said, "I believe that we are engaged in a civil rights struggle at the beach." And another, "The Black Surfing Association is simply a chapter in a much larger story about wave riding as it relates to the African diaspora and its black people's relationship to the oceans." Here we see how political praxis that extends beyond the personal level can develop through sport, allowing some of these black surfers to develop a critical consciousness that transcends the sport's context. As Wright Mills advised, what seems as personal troubles are rarely such. To understand such inequalities requires for individual experience to be placed in their broader historical and cultural context. According to its founders, parkour is the art of moving fluidly from one part of the environment to another. It does not have a set of rules, and it does not fit existing categories, being described as a sport, an art, and a discipline. Parkour emerged from the multiracial Paris suburbs of Nice in the 1980s, but it was largely underground till the late 90s, when media across many nations were documenting parkour's emergence. Since then, it has spread rapidly through informal networks and sites such as YouTube, particularly amongst young urban populations globally. My research emerged from involvement in a community-funded and led youth project in Sussex in 2008. The organisation wanted to provide a parkour training area for local teenage parkour participants. Widespread misinformation, particularly the media's depiction of parkour as a dangerous and high-risk activity, had created many challenges. As one sport development officer I interviewed put it, kids in hoodies on street corners, you get the same old analogies. You're just teaching the cat burglars of the future. As police officers confirmed that despite this, there was little evidence of disruption, but the kids were continually being asked to move on. So we wanted to understand the activity, its perceived social value, and the impacts of the way parkour was increasingly becoming institutionalised as a form of sport. We examined a range of youth policy initiatives and interventions across which there was a belief that through parkour, individuals learnt to see their relationships to themselves, to others, and their environments differently. It had engaged groups who considered themselves unsporty or disliked PE and team games, and the ethos of non-competitiveness, creativity, support, and inclusivity helped it appeal to diverse groups across ages, genders, and physical abilities. This project led me to working with Performance Parkour, an organisation based in theatre and community dance, and involved with some fascinating projects. They were concerned that if parkour became formally institutionalised as a sport, it would limit its appeal and their ability to practice and teach. The belief that traditional sport has the capacity to act as a panacea for the social concerns of the day, from tackling crime to obesity, is long-standing. Yet research evidence to back this up is surprisingly scarce. Nonetheless, from the late 1990s, sport became central to the British government's social inclusion and health agendas. With growing concerns about young people living increasingly bubble-wrapped and sedentary lives, and questions about traditional sport's capacity to deliver public policy outcomes, activities like parkour were increasingly being advocated. As an Australian government-commissioned report on the future of Australian sport recognised, most team sports were in decline, whereas the growth of individualistic and lifestyle sports was one of the important megatrends of the 21st century sportscape. However, as our report to Sport England back in 2005 had highlighted, informal activities presented many challenges for policymakers, and there was a need to understand and recognise their different cultures and governance structures, many of which lacked having clubs or organisations. So with funding from the Economic and Social Research Council, I led a team to develop an international network to explore these issues and innovative and inclusive approaches to enhancing physically active lifestyles. We brought together academics, policymakers, educationalists and practitioners and held 5 seminars spanning policy, regulation, PE and inclusion strategies. We highlighted that alongside the language of social benefits, ideas about active citizenship and self-responsibility were becoming a focus of much neoliberal public policy. Attitudes to the provision of lifestyle sports were shifting. Rather than participants being perceived as antisocial and deviant, they were being embraced as creative, entrepreneurial, neoliberal citizens. However, this raised social justice concerns as being a good and healthy citizen was being equated with individual lifestyle choices, masking forms of inequality and of collective or state responsibility. It was frustrating and gratifying that the points we had raised back in 2005 were finally recognised in the new sports strategy for England launched in 2015, where lifestyle, informal and non-competitive sport was seen as key in order to tackle high levels of inactivity and flatlining sport participation. Similarly, a report Sport England commissioned on outdoor participation trends I advised on reported a shift towards taking part for more functional or lifestyle reasons, claiming that 60% of adults indicate they're not more active because they just don't like sports and they find the structures a turn-off. This situation finds parallel in other countries, including New Zealand, where national sport policymakers, often wedded to particular sports, are recognising the importance of more informal activities. As the COVID pandemic vividly illustrated, informal sports activities were central ways for people to cope during the times of restriction, and as some of my more recent research has shown, continue to provide widespread individual and community well-being benefits. In 2010, my Brighton colleagues, Tomlinson and Sugden, were editing a book on the London 2012 Olympics. I had been fascinated by the Olympics since taking a class as an undergraduate, learning how politics had been intertwined in the Games, from boycotts, propaganda and protests, to the ways women had had to fight for space and recognition. In recent times, with multiple scandals, the continuing relevance of the Olympics was being questioned by scholars and publics alike. Therefore, as this book advised, our task was to look behind the spectacle and these magical moments of human accomplishment to interrogate the utopian projections of Olympism and the broken promises. Holly Thorpe, now my colleague, was visiting our research centre. With her expertise on snowboarding, we collaborated to explore the role and impact of action sports, such as snowboarding, BMX, and windsurfing on the Olympics. This was to be the beginning of a 10-year collaboration. Our research showed that younger Olympic television viewers had been declining for decades. The IOC had tried to attract younger audiences by incorporating action sports in both the summer and winter programs. Despite its controversial inclusion in the 1998 Winter Olympics, snowboarding was credited with a 48% increase in 18 to 24-year-old viewers at the 2010 Games. However, the audience for the Summer Games continued to fall, particularly in key consumer markets such as the US. The median age of the US TV audience for the 2016 Rio Games was 53, and between London and Rio, there was a 30% drop in the 18 to 34 age TV viewers. The IOC were clearly concerned. The arrival of the new president back in 2013 and the introduction of his Agenda 2020 strategy with its three key pillars, credibility, sustainability, and youth, accelerated the modernizing process. Agenda 2020 was the IOC's effort to appear to become more relevant in a quickly changing sport media landscape. Shortly afterwards, 2014, I was invited to Lausanne by the head of summer sports programs to discuss how new action sports might help address youth relevance, urbanization trends, and gender equity. Shortly after that, I came to Waikato to join Sport and Leisure Studies. The group had gained an international reputation for its critical sports scholarship through the works of scholars such as Doug Booth, Tony Bruce, Richard Pringle, Bob Reinhardt. And action and lifestyle sports was a research focus for several current staff, including Holly, Bob, Lisa Hunter, Rebecca Olive, Mike Brown, and Hamish Crockett. Early in 2015, Holly and I secured an IOC Advanced Research Programme grant to develop our research on the IOC's attempt to bring new action sports under their umbrella. Soon after we started, the IOC and Tokyo organising committees announced they had shortlisted 5 new sports, including skateboarding, surfing, and sport climbing, for inclusion in the Tokyo Games. In 2016, we were invited back to Lausanne to present our emerging research to the IOC Executive Board to help in their decision to ratify inclusion of these new sports. At the end of last year, we published our monograph based on this research, from the development of the relationship between action sports and the Olympics through to the postponed Tokyo Games in 2021. Our research shows the complex struggles and workings of power within the Olympic movement, and also in these action sports cultures and industries. Our focus ranges from gender equity and diversity to the politics of sport governance, and the national differences in the professionalisation of these self-governing action sports. We used a longitudinal and multi-method approach to explore how each different action sport, their industries and participants responded to Olympic inclusion, both initially and over the following 5 years, and the roles and motivations of the different power brokers, including the IOC, the media, and the action sport industries. We also organised 2 symposia here in Aotearoa, which helped to understand the national policy and funding landscape and struggles for our athletes and action sport administrators. For many sports fans, the addition of action sports raises questions about whether these are real Olympic sports. However, ideas about what is a legitimate sport will continue to shift over the coming years as the IOC stakes its claim in an increasingly competitive sport and leisure market. With the survival of the Games so dependent on viewers and sponsorship dollars, the IOC will only fight harder to stay relevant to the next generation of fans. This is also evident in the inclusion of kite foiling and breakdancing in the Paris 2024 Games, and the interest that the IOC are taking in parkour and esports, further pushing boundaries of what sport is in the 21st century, despite the challenge this presents for their traditional core audiences and stakeholders. Ultimately, the complex and dynamic relationship between action sports and the Olympic Games has been a revealing case for analysing and interpreting the broken promises as well as the utopian projections of Olympism that Sugden and Tomlinson called for. Our research also shows, in Wright Mills's words, that to understand society and help create social change, we need to expose how powerful and undemocratic groups like the IOC continue to yield power and control. As my talk has shown, my sociological imagination led me to focus on informal and lifestyle sport. But through this, my research went in many different directions, just some of which I've shown you today. And these continue in my ongoing work, such as my research looking at blue space and human ocean well-being in Aotearoa. Wright Mills suggested that stimulating the sociological imagination involves a sense of playfulness, but also a truly fierce drive to make sense of the world. I still feel this sense of excitement and also of passing it on to my students. I remember how thrilled I was early in my career when one undergraduate who had really struggled in understanding the point of my class came bursting into my office. Belinda, I get it now. Oh my God, I am never going to see the world in the same way again. Being in Aotearoa for over 7 years, I have experienced many different things, particularly through learning about Maturanga Māori. I'm very grateful to all the colleagues, students, and research participants who have generously shared their knowledge and from whom I've learnt so much, particularly in understanding my own positionality and place in the world. Through these different perspectives, I will continue to develop my own sociological imagination. There is a Māori proverb I'm sure you're familiar with, that I feel speaks to my journey well, and that Wright Mills probably would have liked as well. He aa, ti maia no o ti ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is the people, it is the people, it is the people. There are many people I would like to acknowledge as part of this journey, both near and far, but I'm just going to mention a few of them. In my first job in London, Professor Jennifer Hargreaves, in the top right, in the middle, she was an inspirational role model, particularly in standing up for equity and social justice, both in her groundbreaking feminist research on sport and physical culture and in the workplace. Jenny showed me what a commitment to feminism looks like, and that it's rarely the easy path. She also became my academic mum, feeding me amazing food and red wine in her kitchen. At the University of Brighton, my colleagues in sport and leisure cultures, they provided a unique working environment, a collectivity infused with intellectual passion and rigour, and a desire to make a difference, and very many hours in the pub. My long-standing feminist collective, Louise, Jane, and Becky, we met as PhD students, but have remained colleagues and friends. They have been my rock for many years. Thank goodness for Zoom. Then came my journey to Aotearoa. Thank you to all of those who encouraged me to come and made me welcome, especially Tony Bruce, who couldn't be here tonight, but she let us live in her house. And to all of those I've met and worked with from my initial home in sport and leisure studies, then Te Oranga, the School of Human Development and Movement Studies, and now health. However, a particularly heartfelt thank you to my research collaborators here in Aotearoa, Holly, Beck, Lizette, Jordan, Marg, Lisa Hunter, Robin Cairns, Rob, Iski, Georgina. I also want to mention all of those I worked with on the core in 2020, Te Waimanawa Centre for Freshwater Research, especially James Brasington, Tim Manukau, and Persephone and John Tyrrell in the research office. I love the choreo, and thanks for getting me involved. I've been fortunate to supervise some fantastic PhD students from around the world. Those aren't my PhD students. Those are some of my colleagues. And I've shared these journeys with amazing women, Holly, Robin, and Lizette. And this has been a real highlight. And I have to just say that a huge bunch of flowers arrived for me in the foyer from my PhD students, each of which have written some lovely words, and they're mostly around the world in different places. Finally, thank you to everyone here today who has joined me to celebrate this milestone in my journey. Sadly, this audience can't include many important people in my life. Both my parents passed away over the last 2 years during the COVID pandemic. They were a huge source of support and inspiration throughout my life. Both were thrilled when I became a professor. I'm not sure if I ever convinced my dad of the value of social science, but I'm sure he would have enjoyed my talk tonight, and he definitely developed his own sociological imagination. I'm very grateful to have my close whānau, Stuart, and our kids, Poppy and Ollie, here tonight. I hope you didn't bring Cookie and Noodle. Stuart has been our rock, holding family life together, sometimes across continents and through very challenging times. Without your support, I would not be here today.